speak. Dom kind of gave the background about me. I'm just, I work at Duke. Lucky to be here at Harvard for the next 2 years. As far as my writing background, I don't have any kind of degree in journalism. Never really studied it formally. I just love to write. Always thought it was cool, and I kind of started journaling and writing op-eds when I started residency. So that was really only a few years ago. So if you guys are starting now, probably a lot of you will be ahead of the curve. And I think it's something that really all of us in academics know how to write. We do it all the time for manuscripts, and academic publications. So writing op-eds is just tweaking your style just a little bit and learning how to talk to general audiences and not academics. And if people have questions, feel free to interrupt or put it in the chat, and we could go through those. There'll also be some time at the end to go through any kind of questions that people have. There we go. So why do I think journalism is important? It truly is one of the best ways to engage academics and non-academics. When you think about, like, when we write, a lot of times in academics, we have these echo chambers where we all know what we're talking about, and we're talking to people who already know what they're talking about. But what really matters is all the people out in civil society. Those people are the people that vote for politicians, vote for policies, get money and donate to causes. So it's not enough to just, especially in global surgery, where we are a new field, or global health in general, we need money, we need support. Writing is one of the best ways to get those messages out there, get the message out. So some examples, like just off the top of my head, if you think about Mountains Beyond Mountains, which, I'm sure everybody here has read that book. No one even knew what global health was. Like, nobody knew it was a thing until this book came out. And granted, it's not an op-ed, it's a book, that followed Paul Farmer's life, but it's a really good example about how a lot of people learned about global health. I mean, I know I didn't even know. That's probably a big reason why I got into medicine and global health in the first place. Another prominent author is Atul Gawande. He writes for the New Yorker. He has several, many books out, and he's become well known, and he's very good at getting his advocate for the things that matter to him, which is mostly policy type stuff. So just another thing to reiterate my point is, this is just from Wikipedia. This is all the U.S., the ranking order of U.S. newspapers. Sorry. Look at that circulation. We're in the 2 millions here with the Wall Street Journal, 1 million for the New York Times. So that's a huge number of people that you can potentially reach by getting into any one of these newspapers. Here's another example. This is a piece I wrote for Forbes. And up here in the corner, you can see there's 23,000 views. I guarantee that is way more than all of my academic publications combined. I've been published in World Neurosurgery, Journal of Neurosurgery, like that's nothing compared to this. So, potentially 23,000 people read this article, and hopefully I changed some minds. So I kind of think of publications in 3 different categories. So you have your academic, there we go. You have your academic journals. Those are what we're used to, but a lot of these journals have a space for editorials, perspective pieces. Those are also good because in my field, for instance, neurosurgery, a lot of neurosurgeons don't really understand what global health is, what global surgery is. A lot of neurosurgeons still don't think that neurosurgery really has a role to play. So I've definitely published, and I'm talking to neurosurgeons specifically saying, hey, this is how we get involved. Like, our field does play a role on the global scheme. And so I think that's definitely one type of publication that we can be reaching with our message. Then there's a variety of publications I like to call academic mainstream. Those are mainstream journals or mainstream publications that are free or online, but that anyone can access, but kind of more academic people like to access those. So one example is Lancet Global Health blog, Doximity, our blog at PGSSC, Stat News. Yes, they are mainstream, but most of those people reading it will be physicians or academics or people who have a general sense of what these things are. And then the third category is just plain old mainstream. So newspapers, any newspaper, online publications like The Atlantic, Daily Beast, there's The Guardian, New York Times. those are meant for everybody. And so you really have to understand which place you're writing to and know your audience for each one. So when I'm writing in the main, like if I'm writing a piece for a mainstream newspaper, people don't have any clue what global health is. So you really got to break it down. You know, it's very true. I think the average person has like, you know, a high school reading level or something like that. I mean, it's different from different places, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about where you want to put your piece. So here's some tips I've learned along the way. Always be on the lookout for article ideas, and just keep a list on your phone. Like we go to so many conferences and we hear speakers talk, we look on Twitter, there's some cool news out there. So it's nice just to keep a running tally of things that you say, oh, like that'd be a great article to write. And then when you have time, kind of look through your list and see what interests you. Asking around, doing some investigating, and kind of with that, it's interviews are definitely good. They help your articles. So if you find yourself at a conference and you think this would be a great thing to write an op-ed, go up to that speaker and ask them for some quotes. Tell them you're thinking about an article, or get their email address and then get it later. One thing I'll say is if you do get anyone quoted, you just need to make sure that they have their approval. So if I write something and I quote somebody, I'll always just send them the final draft and be like, hey, this is how I used your quote in the context. Are you okay? So that's something to think about. When you go on to the actual writing, so length is important. Length is huge. So if you're writing for JAMA or the Lancet, a lot of times the word length is something around 1,500 or maybe even 2,000. If you're writing an op-ed, like say just to a newspaper, New York Times, for instance, 1,000 words is your max, and really I shoot for 700. It's actually hard to write in something that short. 700 words is nothing. That's a page pretty much. So you got to you learn how to get to the point and be very succinct. But again, especially if you're going more mainstream, it's okay to add emotion. It's okay to add creativity. And the opinion is the important thing. That op-eds, a lot of people think that stands for opinion. It doesn't actually, but that's what people are looking for. When you read these magazines and these newspapers, your piece will go in the opinion piece. So yes, it's good to restate a conference or a paper that you find interesting, but the part that makes it an op-ed is you adding your opinion. Why is that important? Why should we care? What should we be doing? Et cetera, et cetera. Getting to the point kind of goes with the short length. And I think practicing on your own is really good. So I recommend to anybody who's interested in writing to keep a diary or journal. A lot of times I'll write things that I see on rounds, or just like clinical things that feel like I have a lot of emotion behind them. And then when I go to write a piece later, I kind of look through my journal. And some of the stuff I've published came straight out of like a diary that I write. So it's just good practice too. And then if you find a topic that you're passionate about, try writing it in multiple different versions. You can use the same stats and just tweak it enough so it's different, and then you can try getting that piece out into several different types of publications. So I can't reiterate this last point enough, and I know I talked about already. You really have to know your audience, and I think that's something we've struggled a little bit. This year as a group at PGSSC, we try our best to get as many op-eds out and get our messages out. I think what it's always important to remember is people, the general public, it's hard for us to know because we are around academics and people who are really passionate and interested in global surgery, but the average Joe out there doesn't know anything about that. Most people don't really know what global health is. When people do know about global health, they usually just think about it in terms of, right now, Ebola, Zika, HIV, TB, malaria. No one even really understands this abstract notion about global surgery. UHC is another thing that we're going to talk about later, universal health coverage. No one really understands that either to a large degree. No one really understands how surgery relates to that. And some people don't even agree with it or care with it. So you have to spend a lot of time in your article just kind of laying the groundwork for some of these topics, which can be hard because you're strapped for time. So it's definitely an art, and we're still learning how. So I encourage you to just be think carefully about who we're talking to and how you can get them engaged, and also have them change their mind about what exactly global surgery is. Okay, so again, this point is also important. Once it's written, have it edited. You're way more likely to get it published if it's clean. So I think I don't know because I'm not an editor for these places, but I have a feeling we've had some really great pieces that maybe didn't get picked just because maybe there's a few too many grammatical errors or the flow wasn't right. These editors pretty much just want to publish something that's ready to go. So I asked family, I asked friends, try to get as many people to look over as I possibly can. And then, yeah, editors don't want to spend too much time editing submissions. So, okay, now you've written an op-ed. We'll talk about the specifics of how. Now what do you do? So there is a way that you send your articles to editors. Like for instance, if you want to write for the New York Times, there is an op-ed email that you can find online, and it's something like, op-ed@newyorktimes.com, and it's right there. So most places have that. They want to get opinion pieces out. Sometimes you have to be a little creative. Like sometimes I Google like who's the editor for this journal or this newspaper if I can't find it online. So sometimes you do have to be a little creative. And I would suggest to use like your academic email address if you have one. So I haven't really done this. I have a Gmail, and then I have a Duke email and a Harvard email. I try to use the Duke or the Harvard one just because I have a feeling if you're an editor and you're getting 100 submissions a day, you're more likely to pick up the one that looks like it came from a good source. I don't know. And if you don't have one, I think that's also fine. I don't think it's prohibitive. I just think it's something that probably helps. You send it out to an editor, and you probably won't hear back from them. That's totally fine. The way the rules work is basically if you send something out, newspapers have like 3 or 4 days, and then you can send it out to another person. So if you haven't heard from them in several days, just assume that they didn't want it and then move on to your next one. I think I will, with that goes, don't send your piece to multiple newspapers, because the problem is if like say New York Times likes your piece and so does Wall Street, now you're in trouble and you'll be blackballed forever if you have to go to one of them and say like, sorry, I'm publishing this New York Times. So you pick one publication at a time, email the editor, give it a few days. Sometimes they'll write back right away and say, no, we're not interested. Sometimes you don't hear from them, and then you move on to the next one. And then the other thing I like to do is, I have a long list of journals and newspapers and magazines that I would love to be in. And I try to rotate them because I don't want to be emailing like, Wall Street every 2 days when I have something. It is like Wall Street has like 3 or 4 people in their opinion section, and they will start to recognize your email. And if they don't like your work and you keep bugging them, they'll just be less likely to pick it. So I do recommend rotating kind of and trying to get your stuff out to as many different places as possible. And then don't get your feelings hurt, because I've written some things that I thought were, gold, and they just don't land. And that's normal. It's hard to get in. Like I said, I bet some of these newspapers have hundreds of submissions. So a lot of it's just luck, how the guy's feeling that day. Sometimes I'm willing to bet they don't even open it and read it if they're all good on their opinion section. So it doesn't mean anything necessarily if you have a piece that nobody seems to want. Go down the list. I have written things that I've emailed to 10 different newspapers before someone ended up taking it. So it totally is normal. It happens. Don't get your feelings hurt. Quantity over quality is something that I think helps. I try to write as much as I can, and instead of working on one piece forever and ever, like these are quick, so they should be fast, pretty rapid. You can write it in a day, send it out, work on another. So don't give up. Again, that's something I want to make sure is again, it may take time before a piece gets picked. It might be a good idea to hold on to it because the timing is not right. So there's certain days that you could try to get your publication out. So for instance, there's all these international days. There's like International Women's Day, World TB Day. There's a lot of relevant happenings with current events. So one good example is Kate Wall, who works here at PGSSC, wanted to write something about Hurricane Maria. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. So we wrote this op-ed, and we got really lucky because we were about to send it out, or we were kind of tweaking it, working on it. And the next morning, Trump tweeted like something super, super dumb about Hurricane Maria. Something about like he didn't believe the death toll. It came out as 3,000. He said that was not true, and that became a news piece. and you saw Donald Trump's tweet all over the news and people were reacting to it. And so I was like, okay, we got to send this now. And we sent it and it got picked. So the first person we sent it to liked it because they're like, yeah, it's happening in the news. So global surgery is hard because it often is not in the news, but you never know. So be on the lookout if there's something that happens that you can tie your story to a current event. That will go a long way. So just wanted to spend some time talking about the structure of an op-ed, which is a lot of what you think. You need a title, you need intro. I try to come up with a catchy title. They often do change it, but you got to think about your title hooking the editor itself. So you want the editor to get interested. The editor now might change it, but that's okay. And you want to have an intro that hooks people. So this is where you can add a personal story. It could even be done in first person if it's well written. You can be creative and artistic there. Then the body of the op-ed is really where the meat of the point where you're going to talk about the issue or report the event. This is where a lot of your stats go. I try not to overload my essays with too many stats, but I think 1 to 3 of your strongest stats that people will, pause and really stand out, I think should be used. When you're doing citations, you do in-text hyperlinks, which is also something that we're not used to as people in academics. So, most editors won't want like sources at the bottom. They won't want like subscripts in the text. What you do is you highlight the piece. Like if you were writing in your op-ed in a recent report by blank blank, you would maybe highlight report, the word report, right click, and then insert the actual link right there. Because that's how, if you notice, whenever you read online newspapers and things, that's how it works. There's links embedded within the text. And being dramatic and emotional is okay. And being opinionated is okay. Again, that's why your piece got picked, because they're looking for opinion. It's not just good enough to simply state a report or state a study. And then you have a conclusion, and that's where you restate what you said. The other important thing in your conclusion is providing a potential solution. So maybe you just spent the last 600 words talking about a problem, showing some stats, convincing people that there's an issue here. You have to add something at the end that gives some hope and says, this is the problem and this is how I propose to fix it. Otherwise, your piece will feel just like it kind of ends weakly. And then you also need a bio at the bottom, which I'll show you guys later what my bio looks like. So, so I just want to go through some examples. All these examples came from pieces that our advocacy team at PGSSC published. So these are all within the last 6 months, most of them at least. Actually, sorry, this one isn't. This is one I wrote. The global healthcare crisis no one is talking about. You got to use strong words. Crisis, like problem is not strong enough. Trauma surgeons caution global firearm violence, and we published this piece in the Hill right around the time of when there had all these issues with 3D printed guns here in the U.S. Stop Trump's war on global health. Again, it's emotional, it's strong, it's passionate. The missing piece in the struggle for universal health coverage. Again, we're using like struggle. Too many people are dying without access to surgery. I mean, these are emotional, evoking titles, and that's good. Getting to the heart of the matter, the neglected 4.5 billion. That's going to hook people. And then the beginning is also important to be trying to hook people, because that's the first thing they're going to read. So I used a few examples. This one's one that Dom published actually with in our blog. And I love it because it evokes emotion. It talks about a story, and while leading to the point where he's going to then bring up the facts and bring up the stuff. So I'll read it really quick. He was 16 years old and wondered if he could ever survive. Ernesto had a bright future ahead, yet unfairness suddenly made everything fragile. After months of referrals across Rwanda while taking expensive drugs, improvement did not occur and surgical treatment was the last resort. Slowly and little by little, Ernesto's heart condition worsened. He was no longer a typical 16-year-old Rwandan boy playing football with his friends, but one of the millions fearfully waiting for the life-saving miracle. So that, I think, is super strong and powerful, because it talks about, it puts a face to the problem, which is really important, because again, people don't understand what global surgery is, but they understand what a 16-year-old boy, needing surgery is. And I think I have a few others. This is one that Key Park, my mentor, wrote in the New York Times. One cool morning last April in Pyongyang, North Korea, I watched a woman squat over a patch of grass along the Daedong River. A large handkerchief covering her head was knotted below her chin, encircling her sunburned and wrinkled face. As a van passed on the blaring patriotic hymns from the oversized speakers on its roof, she reeded the riverbank. In North Korea, keeping the neighborhood clean is a civic duty, but she was far from any neighborhood. She was gathering the weeds for food. Look at that description. I mean, it's super descriptive, and that's okay. And that's the fun part of writing op-eds. It's the one time in our lives where we can be creative, because you really can't do that in the manuscripts that you're writing. This is the one that I told you about with the Trump tweet and the Hurricane Maria. This one, we went more with like some hard-hitting stats. We wanted numbers to really evoke, stand out to people. Almost 1 year ago, nearly 3,000 Americans lost their lives in one of the deadliest natural disasters to hit U.S. soil in modern history. While initial estimates of Hurricane Maria's collateral damage listed only 64 deaths, a recent study, blah, 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 revealed that actual number was astronomically higher, about 3,000 men, women, and children. So you can also start papers with stats, and I've done that too if they're particularly large or astonishing. This one's kind of long. We don't have to read the whole thing. Basically, I talked about different types of people needing surgery. So I guess I will read it. A woman in rural village in Uganda feels a lump on her right breast as she dressed in the blue light of dawn. Her weathered fingers palpate invisible edges under skin, and anxiety and fear set in on the significance of this finding. Somewhere else in the world, a young man racing down a crowded city street on a motorcycle swerves to avoid a pedestrian and flies off his bike. Oh, sorry. He lands with a sickening crunch on the ground, and his pupils grow as blood fills his brain. A young boy in South America struggles to keep up with his friends during a soccer match as his beating heart hums from the extra turbulence caused by a small hole that hits his wall. What do these people have in common? Although separated by age and geography, they all need one thing desperately: surgery. So that's kind of the lead up. And now in the article, I talked about surgery, and I talked about why that's important and how that relates to NCDs. Oh, this is another one that Dom wrote, which I liked. Sitting in a large auditorium, my eyes scanned across 300 or so highly respected cardiothoracic surgeons who came from all over Japan. Many were dazed, dozing, or fast asleep. All but 5 or 6 of the surgeons were men. The gender imbalance shocked me. It shouldn't have. So I think that's my last example there. But again, just to reiterate that's the beginning is important. That's really what's going to get people hooked. It's going to get the editor hooked onto your story, so he or she picks your story, and then when it's published, it's going to be what gets readers involved and engaged in your points. So again, you finish all your articles with the bio. You should include this. This is just a quick example of mine, just telling who you are, where you're from, what's your background, and then maybe your Twitter handle. I wouldn't make this any more than a couple sentences, because if it gets too long, they're just going to cut it out. Okay, so that's kind of how you write op-eds. That's how you submit them, and that's the process. So now what? Topics to cover. So obviously all of us here, we're interested in global surgery, and that is a huge, nebulous, vague topic that a lot of people don't understand. I think within that, we have universal health coverage, gender equity, non-communicable diseases, global surgery being a component of primary healthcare, and then the Lancet Commission. So there's so many others. Again, you have to remember that most people just don't understand what these broad topics are who are outside of academics. And you do have to spend a good amount of your time just explaining. There's like that one stat, basically in the Lancet Commission, all those like that one page where there's like the 10 main points, those are the stuff you use. Those are what will grab people and will help them understand this problem. So, more deaths than HIV, malaria, and TB combined. That's huge. That's very, very surprising to the average person out there. So use it. And more in universal health coverage, which is kind of what we're interested in now. It's a very timely thing because in New York in September, at UNGA, the high-level meeting is going to be completely dedicated to UHC. And so here's the timeline there. And so there's going to be a lot of talk about that. And that's what we're really trying to advocate for and get a lot of buzz going about what is UHC and how does surgery fit into that. So this is a challenge and opportunity because, like I said, the challenge is that UHC and global surgery are very vague that people don't really understand. But our job is to make them understand that and understand that SAO is a component of UHC and that we need to advocate for full health systems, under UHC that include all these components. So what we were hoping is we want as many people to look in these topics, write op-eds for local newspapers, journals, and write as many as you can in as many different languages we can. And this will help create momentum, which will hold leaders accountable. And eventually, we hope to push the state's involvement in drafting the UHC resolution so that includes surgical care. This can make a big difference. Well-timed articles make a lot of difference, and people start to learn about it. And really, that's our job, is to change people's understanding of what global health is. So that's kind of it. That's all I have. If anyone has any questions or thing, just my email addresses here. I have a Gmail and a Duke email. So people are welcome to reach out if they have specific questions for me, or if they want to just bounce off ideas about potential topics, or maybe have questions about, hey, I have a piece, but I don't know where to send it. I'm happy to help.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie. I had some issues with unmuting because of a limit apparently that exists about unmutes. But thank you so much for your presentation. This was great. I want to reiterate the point, especially the last point, and also a discussion that we just had in the WhatsApp group. So first of all, like to summarize, like Jackie mentioned, especially for fields like global health, global surgery, writing op-eds, writing opinion pieces, editorials, etc., have a huge impact on the people that we want to reach. So the policymakers, the funders, the wider public, in terms of an advocacy perspective. Because typically these are the people who do not dive into PubMed to look at for resources, that do not check journals, which are the most recent papers that come out. They might come across a paper that's published on Twitter, etc., or they might have someone who sends them the most important pieces from recently. But the people that you reach, and the amount of views and the amount of readers that you can get through op-eds, etc., whether it's in a published paper, a published newspaper, like a printed one, or an online one, is just much bigger than the average paper. So that's one thing, especially very important for global health, as opposed to basic sciences, for example. Um, a second thing, as Jackie showed, is that in September, the high-level meeting by the UN on universal health coverage will be coming up. So this is a meeting where all the ministries of health, all the heads of state are coming together to basically discuss what their country is doing in terms of progress towards universal health coverage on a national level, but also in which way they intend, or they hope that the wider community, the global health community, international leaders and organizations like the UN, like the WHO, etc., can push for universal health coverage in countries all around the world. And out of that, there will be a resolution that will pop up. So the resolution on universal health coverage coming out of the high-level meeting. And this is a very important thing, because even though it's not a mandate, so it doesn't necessarily say to countries this is something you have to do. It is similar to the WHO resolutions, that it's a set of guidelines that countries typically follow, because it's reached on consensus by all the countries who give their input, but also by an expert panel set forward by the UN in this case. So it has a very important impact in terms of the policy changes, policy implementations by countries once this resolution gets out. Now, the resolution is currently being drafted, so there's still the opportunity to give input to that, and a lot of non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, etc., are giving input on that, on trying to frame the wording a bit different and trying to obviously push for some agendas. Unfortunately, which was kind of expected, surgery did not make it initially in the resolution. We're hoping that it can make it after after the open consultation for wording or phrasing in the resolution. So hopefully that will still change. But either way, during the high-level meeting in September, all heads of state, etc., and also several non-governmental organizations, some NGOs, some institutions, will have the chance to speak up during the high-level meeting. So this is a very closed meeting. It's not something that's open to the public. It will be something that's open to streaming, so you can still follow it. But for the people who can speak up there, that's very, very important. One, because the entire world is watching, but two, because all the heads of state are there and they can hear what you're saying, and they hopefully will take that into account, similar to what's mentioned in the resolution. But even if something does not get passed on in the resolution, they will still be able to hear the argumentation of, okay, why are people saying this at this high level meeting? So in that case, it's ideally very great if somebody could speak up about surgery. Now, typically heads of state, as I'm sure we're all aware, are unfortunately not thinking about surgery. There are some countries, especially the ones either having finished their national surgical plan or are currently in the process of making them, who are prioritizing surgery to some extent. But a lot of them have competing commitments in terms of infectious diseases like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis. In countries, in high-income countries, it's non-communicable diseases, it's mental health, etc. So different countries have different priorities, especially in under the umbrella of universal health coverage. And in that sense, unfortunately, surgery has not reached the same level of importance for them as other disease groups, and that's something that we all hopefully are able to make a change in. So in that sense, just to come long story short, you are able in a variety of ways to influence your local politicians, local policymakers, etc., not just to enact change in your own local settings, but also hopefully for them or NGOs going to the high level meeting to speak up. And that is where, for example, op-eds or editorials, etc., can play an important role. So if you, for example, I am sure that even your heads of state or the policymakers or the advisors thereof will read the most common newspapers in your country. I know, at least in my country, they do it. When something really big pops up in the US, people are aware of it as well, whether it's because they read it or they see it on Twitter or social media because it stands out. So you have the chance of, in a similar way, being able to influence not just the public, but also the policymakers. So hopefully this will inspire you a bit to also try and write some op-eds in your local journals or local media outlets. Ideally, given the high-level meeting coming up in September about the role of surgery, anesthesia, and obstetrics within universal health coverage. But hopefully this talk will also inspire you to write about other pressing and important topics about actual events happening in your country that definitely need to be addressed. So I'll leave the word back to Jackie or the people who attended to see if there's any questions. And again, Jackie, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any questions from anybody at this point? Okay. I also wanted to add, I forgot to mention that as far as authorship goes, and I don't know the hard and fast rule, but I'd say 1 to 2 authors is probably, you probably don't want to do more than 2 authors. I've never published an op-ed with 3. If you just look at your newspaper and look at the number of authors writing these pieces, but it's usually 1. Sometimes it's 2. So I would just leave it at that. I wouldn't recommend a huge group of people writing, these short op-eds because you may get rejected. But I don't know that for a fact. I just, as from what I've seen.
Okay, it's Sydney. I have a question, please. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello? Okay.
Yep, I can hear you.
Um, okay, Jackie. About opinions, opinionated articles. Is it? Have you ever had to publish, say, a video or any kind of content? Because nowadays, especially around Africa, people are more interested in, pictures, videos. They're more attracted to those than, text.
No,
So
that's a great question. So up until now, I haven't. And I don't know the process behind that, but I have talked to some editors. Like, for instance, I've talked to the editor at Stat News. That's the health and science branch off publication off Boston Globe, and he's saying they're making an active switch into more like other types of digital media outside of just print. So I don't know what that means as far as like how you as a freelance writer reporter would necessarily send something. My guess is like what you could always do, aside from sending fully formed articles, you can also write to someone and pitch the idea. And I've done that a couple times, but you could say, hey, like I have a story about this. Here's a small excerpt, maybe. I want to turn this into a digital, some kind of a video or a clip. And I see that your website or newspaper has that. Would you be interested? And that's totally fine too. Again, you might not hear back, but you could just ask them.
thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, so if that's it, again, if people have more specific questions about, a piece they're working on or just how to do it, I'm happy to hear from you via email or whatever. So definitely reach out if you'd like.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie.
No problem. All right. Bye.